Welcome to the Adult Children Voices Across America Speakers Meeting Podcast. You may attend this meeting live on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific Time using the Zoom ID 848-520-80640, password 061120. For more information about adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families, visit adultchildren.org.
The following speaker share from Ken F., the Intimacy Gram, was recorded on August 15th, 2024.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Ken. Tonight, this was kind of an impromptu speech. I was asked just a couple days ago, and I was just here not too long ago. I would like to kind of tap into some other tools that I've developed when I work with people in ACA, when I work with people at work as a therapist, and that I apply in my own life. So I want to talk about intimacy tonight, because I think this is something that a lot of people have misconceptions over, and a lot of people don't really focus on this. I think it's so important that when I work with people with the steps, before we even start step one, I have them look in and explore kind of their capacity for intimacy, their understanding of intimacy, and the areas that they would like to maybe grow their intimacy. Plain and simply, I define intimacy as closeness. It's the closeness that we have to another person. Most people think of intimacy, they think of sex, or they think of love. And that's usually the two biggest things that step out. But that's not really the core of intimacy. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But first, I'm going to tell you kind of like how this whole thing entered my life. Years ago, I worked in a community clinic, and I did a men's support group on Monday nights. And in the next room, there was a women's support group, and I would go to dinner every Monday night with that therapist. And for some reason, one night we were talking about men versus women, how they view intimacy different. And I said to her, wouldn't it be interesting if we asked each of our groups tonight to come up with a list of what are the things that make a relationship intimate, and then compare the lists. And what we found was really kind of surprising for us, because in our groups, at least, the men had a longer list than the women did. And, you know, my group was all a bunch of heterosexual men, ages 30s and 40s. The majority of them were married. They grew up in an environment where they kind of understood what intimacy was, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. They knew it was out there, they wanted it, but it was kind of something that they were taught to stuff down. So it was really interesting to hear the list that they came up with and to compare it with the women's list. So I really didn't do anything with this for a few years. I changed jobs. I worked in a residential facility for substance users. They were all injection users. Most of them had hepatitis C and HIV. They came in off the court system. A lot of them came in off the streets. And not only did they not really have any understanding of intimacy, they really didn't have any healthy relationships. Most of the relationships were the people that they were using with. And I always say, you know, drugs is kind of like having a boat. If you have a boat, everybody in the world is your friend. And as soon as you sell your boat, there go all your friends. And it's kind of like that with drugs. The people that were coming into my program, the few friends that they had left over, many of them weren't supportive. So how do we create a way to get these people to go out and build healthy relationships? We came up with was a way of diagramming. And there's two parts to the diagram, two main parts. One part is looking at the quality of relationships, and the next part is looking at life balance. For the sake of tonight, I'm going to talk about the intimacy and looking at the quality of relationships. It's a way of diagramming your intimacy and your life balance called an intimacy gram, for intimacy diagram. And I've been teaching this now for almost 30 years. And the way that I usually start out in a classroom is I ask everybody to write on a piece of paper like 1 to 40 or 1 to 45. And then I ask everybody to start throwing out what are the factors of intimacy. And usually in the beginning, I get, sex. So I get love, trust. Sometimes I hear communication, and then it kind of stalls. People kind of have a hard time thinking about what makes a relationship intimate. And usually by the time we get to about 20 or 25, their brains start clicking and they start thinking, yeah, I mean, I get it now. I see there's all this stuff that make a relationship what it is. So I'm going to go over kind of a generic list really quick. I was asked if there are any handouts or any screen sharing, and I don't trust myself with screen sharing. So if anybody wants to find the handouts, I can tell them where I have a website where this stuff is listed. But I'm going to go over the factors of intimacy, just kind of a generic view. And if you guys want to write this down, if you want to take notes, that's fine. I'll try to go slow. Here are what I call the factors of intimacy, or the building blocks of intimacy. We have acceptance, accessibility, availability, and proximity, affection and touch, authenticity, balance, being in the moment, comfort, commitment, communication, compassion, compatibility, empathy, encouragement and challenge, equity, forgiveness, gratitude and appreciation, healthy boundaries, history, honesty, humility, identification, interdependence, kinship, love, loyalty, mutual attraction, and that could be sexual attraction, it could be intellectual attraction, open-mindedness, passion, patience, playfulness, respect, risk, romance, security, sex, shared background and experiences, shared beliefs, shared goals, shared humor, shared interests, shared values, sincerity, support, surrender and compromise, tolerance, transparency, trust, understanding, value, vulnerability, and willingness. This list over the years has evolved. There's things on here that I think I have on a list on my desk at work that people have added. I had somebody from a culture who basically said food. They saw food as intimate because the way they came together and the way they cooked the food, it was just something intimate and a way of bringing people close together through their food. So this list isn't cast in stone. There might be other things on here that I have clearly left off, but this is kind of the list that we're going to work with tonight. And I want you to think of all these things like building blocks. And if you notice my shirt, I'm wearing my Lego shirt. So this is my Intimacygram shirt that I like to wear when I teach, because I want everybody to think of all these factors of intimacy like different bricks in a Lego set. And every relationship you have in your life, and I don't mean romantic relationship, I mean the mailman, your children, your sponsor, different people in this meeting. I want you to think of everybody in your life like a different box of Legos. And some people that you don't know very well, you have a few of these things on in your box. People that you are very, very close with, you have a lot of them. So this is kind of a really good place to start, because I think a lot of people, when they take this list and they look at it, they realize there's a lot more that goes into a relationship. And working with individuals that are in recovery that have to put relationships back together, or couples that have to come and put their relationships back together, a lot of times when I say, where do you want to start? They're like, everywhere, everything needs to be done. And when I hand them this list and say, we're only going to start with one thing, let's just pick one thing on this list and not ignore everything else, but just let's focus for a week or two on just one thing and see what happens when you focus on one of these things. And when I do this with a group, often I'll ask everybody in the group to pick one thing on this list and to focus on this one thing with everybody for the next week. So if they pick communication, and communication has two parts to it. It has the part where you're listening and the part where you're speaking. So some people aren't good communicators because they're just impatient and they don't listen. So if they want to work on communication, what that means is for a week, they really have to stop and focus on what someone's saying and maybe even repeat back to them to get clarity and understanding. Or maybe somebody is in the opposite end, they don't feel like they have a voice. So for a week, they're going to try to speak up. They're going to try to put their thoughts, feelings out there with everybody, but only that one thing. Some people are trying to be more present. So what they do is they make it a commitment to be where they need to be when they're supposed to be there. And that's the one thing that they focus on. But just to focus on one of these things to not get overwhelmed. What a lot of people freak out when they see this list, and I can identify with that too, is for a lot of us that grew up in dysfunctional households, not a lot of these things were modeled to us. So there's certain things on this list that we've heard the word before, but we really don't know what it means. And I have another list of what I call intimacy killing factors. If you're working your steps, these are all things that would kind of go with your survival traits and character defects, whichever way you want to call them. And these are the intimacy killing factors. So these are the things that destroy all those Legos. And those are abandonment, anger, avoidance, abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, verbal, or neglect, blame, catastrophizing, competition, conflict of interest, deceit, depression, discontentment, dishonesty, disinterest, disloyalty, distrust, envy, fear, greed, hate, impatience, infidelity, irrational thinking, irresponsibility, lust, martyrdom, mind reading, rationalization, misrepresentation, resentment, selfishness, shame, smothering, which is excessive caretaking, vengeance, and unavailability. A lot of us know those things. Those are things that maybe we learned from our parents or other people around us. Maybe those were modeled for us, and those are things that we're familiar with and might be parts of ourselves we're not very proud of. But looking back on the things that do create intimacy that we might be missing. For me, the things that I really wasn't raised with, affection really wasn't something in my family. I rarely ever saw my parents show any affection to each other. There was one day I remember as an adult where I was playing billiards with my parents, and I really felt at that point, and I was in my 30s, it was like the first time I ever saw my parents kind of clicking and enjoying being in their own company, because I never really saw them, give hugs or kisses or anything like that. So affection was something that I really, I think I was starving for, but I really didn't understand what it was. I didn't know how to get it. Being in the moment, like I said, my parents were all about, productivity and getting everything done. And, money had to be saved. You couldn't spend money on something that would be enjoyable because that would be irresponsible. They just didn't know how to just enjoy being in the moment. Although if anybody knows me, people know that I do not have a problem with that any longer. Empathy is something that wasn't really shown to me as a child. And, encouragement and challenge. It was black or white. You either did something or you didn't, but nobody stood behind me and said, hey, these are your dreams. I really want to support you and I want to encourage you to reach these dreams. Okay. Healthy boundaries, that was another thing that just didn't exist in my family. And I think with most people with dysfunction, there's a lot of dysfunctional boundaries and not something healthy. For me, I would come home from school and I'd be looking for my favorite toy and it would be gone. And I'd be looking everywhere for it and not sure what I did with it or where I put it. And when I would ask my mother what happened to it, she would say something like, "Oh, well, you outgrew that. So I threw that in the trash and went out with the trash today," or "I donated that to the Goodwill." So the boundaries in my house were very, very blurred of what was mine and what wasn't mine. And then another one was security. Even though I grew up in a house where I lived in the same house from the time I was 3 until I was 25, and things were really, really stable, I didn't have a good sense of security. I was raised with all these stories of children getting kidnapped. So every night when I would go to bed and I would hear a noise outside my window, I automatically, jumped to the stories that my dad taught me and would think that there was something horrible going to happen to me. And then when I'd run down to my parents and want nurturing and support and guidance, they would just send me up to bed and say it was all in my head. Yes, it was in my head, but they put it there. So I don't know if anybody here can relate also to, looking at these factors of intimacy and really struggling because you don't really understand them. And I understand that there's a lot of cultural significance with this. If you look at it from kind of like an anthropological point of view, as society has changed over the years, I think we have more time to get in touch with our feelings. I think a couple hundred years ago, it was all about making sure the cows were milked and making sure that you were fed, and feelings weren't that important. It was all about survival. I think in our culture in the United States, we've moved past that like 150 years ago, 100 years ago. But there are other cultures in the world that have not. And there are people that have come over to our culture that are still, just maybe one generation away from that. So we kind of are upset with our parents, or we're upset with our life and God or whatever, because our childhood wasn't what we wanted it to be. But I think we have to look from a point of view in terms of, what is it that society was teaching us, and what did society teach our parents and parents before that? I know as a kid, when I'm starting to develop my concept of closeness and intimacy, I was at a friend's house one day and we were talking, and I think I was like 10 or 11 years old. I think I was like in 6th grade. And we were talking, and somehow it came out that her parents were a different political party than my parents were. And I remember just feeling like I was with the enemy. And I even made a comment. It's like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be over here. I'm supposed to be associating with you because you're the bad guys. And I remember she looked at me and she's like, "Well, aren't you German? Because, my grandfather fought against the Germans in the war. So you're the enemy. I don't know if you should be at my house right now." And I remember going home just feeling like, wow, I might have lost a friend because of what society was telling me who I could be with and who I couldn't be with. I think we both talked to our parents about it, and they told us that was all grown-up stuff, and that didn't matter for us, or it shouldn't matter for us. And I think we were probably good in playing the next day. But I do think that stuff does stick in our heads. And I think as we get older, we remember that stuff, and we remember the us against them. And that programming, it's so hard to get past that and realize that, we're all people that are struggling with intimacy. We're all people that are struggling with closeness. And a lot of us, even though we might be reacting to someone else who might not be giving us what we need, it might not be necessarily their fault, that they're just also operating on the programming that they were given. So that's something that I always try to keep in mind. With that, I like to say that the whole intimacy thing, I think, really comes to play with working the steps. And I think when you have an idea of the intimacy and the factors before you start working the steps, you really can take a deeper look at what's happening with you with the steps. I see it as a kind of a resource that you can use to tap into. And I would like to wrap up in about 5 minutes or so, because I wanted to do a little different format tonight. I wanted to maybe open up for use the last 15 minutes of my share to maybe do 15 minutes of questions and answers before we do the open sharing. So I kind of want to just wrap up with a couple things. I want to say that in looking at all the relationships you have in your life as boxes of Legos, I have this imaginary bookshelf that has 5 shelves on it. And this is how I categorize my boxes of Legos. The bottom shelf, which holds the boxes that are most empty, I call those distant. Those are where my acquaintances are, the people I really don't know very well. The next level up is familiar. These boxes have a little bit more Legos in there. I can build a little bit more with it. Maybe there's more of the same pieces in there, but there's still not the whole variety. These are my everyday friends. These might be my neighbors. These might be my coworkers. The next shelf up, the third shelf, I call that personal. These boxes have a lot more Legos in them. These are where I have my close friends. These are maybe where my kids would be. These were where, I'm trying to put my parents and put other people in my life. And then the fourth level is called private. So this level is where we have our deepest relationships that are human. This is where we want to put our spouse. This is where we want to put maybe our parents. This is where we maybe want to put a therapist or sponsor, a pastor. And the top level is true private. True private is where we put our spiritual relationships. This is where we put our relationships with our higher power. This is where we put our relationships with our pets, our infants, people who have passed away. This is where we put our relationship with our substances, whether it be cigarettes, alcohol, gambling. If we're textaholics, it's where we put our phones. And I think when we have this visualization of where we actually place people, we realize who are the people in our life that are close to us and who are the people that aren't. And with the people that I worked with that were off the streets and out of prison and didn't really have anybody in their life, we kind of made it a game. Every 3 months, we wanted them to target people to work on and bring them into one shelf. So after 3 months, they would get a whole bunch of names and phone numbers and have a whole bunch of acquaintances. They'd have a lot of people on that bottom shelf. Everything else was empty, but that bottom shelf was getting full. So then we would ask them after 3 months, what 3 or 4 people can you target at this bottom level that maybe you have some things in common that you would want to build a relationship with? And if so, what are the factors of intimacy that you need to work on to move these people up to the next level? So that by the time they graduated after a year or so, they had some really good friends in their life. And that's kind of the whole point is the solution says, this is a program of action coming from love. And I think part of the action is to work on these factors of intimacy. And when you have an understanding of these and you have an understanding of which relationships are classified in your distant, which relationships are in your personal and your familiar and your private, it kind of helps you then when you look at step 1, looking at what are you powerless over and who are you powerless over? What relationships, you might be able to stand up for yourself. You might be able to try to set boundaries, but there are certain people out there that just aren't ever going to respect your values. There are certain people out there that they don't have very good communication. So looking at the people in your life and the people in your life where there might be some dysfunction, how are you powerless over them? Maybe you're powerless over them with setting boundaries. Maybe you're powerless over them, like I said, with communication or respect. And then moving into the second step is looking at where is your spirituality? Because so many of us, when we get involved with codependency, when we get involved with substance abuse, when we become isolated or depressed, a lot of times our higher power kind of gets pushed aside and we lose the intimacy we have with that spiritual relationship because we build other relationships with things that are not functional. So that's where step 2 comes in, and step 3 with that. And step 4 in taking an inventory, looking at the different people in your life, whether they be people that are really close to you or really far away. Often the people that are the closest to us are the ones that we have the most hurt with because they mean the most to us. And as I said before, when you get into the other steps, like looking at resentments and character defects, a lot of the intimacy killers come up with that. I know this is a lot of information. As a presenter, my hope is always that you walk out of here with one tidbit of information. And if all this stuff, if you got one little thing out of it, then I feel like I'm being of service and doing what I'm supposed to do. So I'm going to go over the list just one more time, and the factors of intimacy. And like I said, if anybody has any questions, then you're welcome to ask by raising your hand in the chat in a second. And what we'll do is we'll turn off the recording so that your questions aren't recorded. The topic that I do want to do later is just what factors of intimacy do you struggle with? And it might be as it relates to your laundry list traits, because maybe your fear of authority might have to be with you having difficulty with accepting people for who they are. It might be because you have a hard time with forgiveness. Maybe you have difficulty feeling respect from these people. So kind of to see how these factors play into the laundry list. So here's the list one more time. Acceptance, accessibility, availability, and proximity, affection and touch, authenticity, balance, being in the moment, comfort, commitment, communication, compassion, compatibility, empathy, encouragement and challenge, equity, forgiveness, gratitude and appreciation, healthy boundaries, history, honesty, humility, identification, interdependence, kinship, compatibility, love, loyalty, mutual attraction, open-mindedness, passion, patience, playfulness, respect, risk, romance, security, sex, shared background and experiences, shared beliefs, shared goals, shared humor, shared interests, and shared values, sincerity, support, surrender and compromise, tolerance, transparency, trust, understanding, value, vulnerability, and willingness. And if anybody would like to know where this handout is, like I said, this is called an intimacygram, the whole thing of diagramming the intimacy. And the website is theintimacygram.com. So if you just go onto the intimacygram.com, you can pull up this worksheet from there.